This is Mxnzplain. My name is Kabelo and
I'm Kabelo and the two of us decided to begin this journey of just creating spaces for men to reflect on what it means to be a man in the 21st century. Our task is really to journey with men, listen to different stories, but to create an environment where we can all just learn and grow with each other. It's a journey.
Yeah. So if you're interested in mansplaining on their spirituality, their traumas, and all things important about being a man in the 21st century, it's the place for you to come to.
Mxnzplain is for me, for you, it's for all of us. So join in and be part of our journey.
Welcome everybody. This is Mxnzplain. My name is Kabelo and as always, I'm with my friend
Kabelo and as always, you know, we're here to just create moments and opportunities to have conversations about stuff that we've battled with, stuff that we're navigating, and stuff that we're trying to understand, mainly about ourselves, but specifically as men, trying to survive this thing called life. So yeah, welcome to Mxnzplain. It is your space, it's my space, it's our space. And today we decided to have a conversation around something that I think many of us have struggled with, right? And we went back and forth in this chat trying to figure out, like, how do we go about this? And it's a conversation around imposter syndrome, right? And I think imposter syndrome is such a big thing for so many of us, whether it is conscious or subconscious. I think many of us have actually struggled with it. And so in our conversation, we were reflecting on moments where we felt this thing happening, right? And I think, you know, one of our team members mentioned the whole impact of social media and how social media somewhat contributes to that. But for me, I thought to myself, the first time I experienced imposter syndrome.
Wait, first, I mean, what is imposter syndrome in your understanding?
So for me, imposter syndrome is that feeling of I'm not good enough, right? It is that feeling of the person next to me or the person in the room knows more about what we're here to do, right? So when you're sitting around a table and say it's a conversation, it's a table full of, say, accountants, right? And you walk into the room, you may have the same qualification, you may have gone to the same institution as those individuals, but if they are slightly more articulate or appear to be slightly more confident than you are, there's almost an immediate reflection on, maybe I don't belong in this room. Maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe I should yield to Lebo because Lebo looks like he understands this better than me, right? And I think it happens to many of us for multiple reasons, right? And I think for me, one of the earliest memories of this was going to a debate tournament, right? So we were, and I guess, so I was in a township school, and you get to this debate tournament, and there's all this excitement about this township school that broke into first language English debate, into a debate section, right? So we get there and you walk in and immediately it's all these boys and girls with blazers and all sorts of scrolls, right? And that time, like grade 7 or so, right?
Looking professional.
Right? They look like they know what they're here to do. And we're sitting there with our little jerseys and ties, because blazer was not, it was a luxury. So you had one or two kids who wore, you know, blazers to school, but even then it wasn't a thing.
Just for context, what school were you
so at that point in time, I was at a school called Tsimologo, right? It is in Middlelands, Zone 9. So yeah, so
you're competing in the suburbs at this point.
Literally,
right? Cool.
So because public speaking has always been a thing, so I've always enjoyed public speaking. And we then formed a team of individuals who went to go do this thing. So you walk into the space and you see all these boys and girls and blazers and scrolls, and you immediately think, flip, why did we come here? I don't belong here, right? And right there and then you begin to question your ability to speak. You begin to question your intellect. You begin to question how you look. You start thinking about your school, everything, like your reality of where you come from in that space comes to like the front of your mind, right? And right there, you start to almost like panic, right? You go into panic mode. And at the end, sharp, you go through the tournament and we won, right?
You guys won the tournament?
We won, yes, right? But at the same time, you walk away with this huge excitement of, damn, I'm actually not as bad as I thought I was. But when you walked into that room, the room was not inviting enough, and you started doubting your abilities, right? And thinking, I don't belong here.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is like a big part of what this imposter syndrome thing is
Yeah.
being in certain spaces, certain rooms, professions, whatever, personal or like work life, where you feel like you are not enough
Yeah.
to be in that room, and therefore you end up shrinking as opposed to being your fuller self
Yes.
in that particular room. And that could be because of your own kind of biases or thoughts, and it could be because of other people.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So in your adult life, because that's a great story, like in school, and it just so happens that it worked out well, right? I would have been interested in hearing how you dealt with it in the moment to still do what you needed to do, like for that example.
Yeah.
But in your adult life as well, if you can give an example of how that has played itself out, like what have there been in situations where you've walked into rooms as who you are, and felt like, I don't think I'm enough here.
So to be honest with you, I think the most recent one was probably, I think, last year. I had been invited to do a training for, the executive team of the IEB. And so these are the guys who set exams for all the private schools in the country, right? So they moderate in terms of the quality of the paper and all of that. So I'd been invited basically, from the directors to the CEO of the IEB, all of them were in this room. And there's like all sorts of professors from like Wits, UJ, who sit on this body. And on my way there, right, even prepared doing the presentation itself, I kept on changing my slides, changing my arguments, and something that I probably could have just finished and rounded off in like a week in terms of just thinking through it thoroughly took me way longer, right? And I remember driving there, and as I'm driving there, I'm panicking.
And this happened before you even get into
before
the room.
I even get there,
Okay,
right?
so this is kind of internal dialogue and thoughts,
right? Because one, you're like, this is the IEB, right? And immediately you're like, you think of the men and women who will be in that room, and you're like, these are the people who influence curriculum, in the private school sector, right? And who the hell am I to be speaking to them on how to make education or exams accessible, right? Because that was my brief. It was around how do we make education accessible for boys and girls who learn differently from different cultural backgrounds, sexuality, gender, and all of that, right? And I remember panicking in the car. And right then I called Tebe, and I said to Tebe, I'm going to this thing. I think I'm going to screw it up. I'm nervous. I'm very anxious. I don't think I don't think I deserve to be there.
Again, this is happening before you go
before I even get into the room, right? And then Tebe says to me, is like, look, the fact that they called you and they asked you to come do this means you have something to offer. Focus on what you have to offer and not who they are, right? And right there and then you're like, flip. You have all the master's degree, the honors, right? You have multiple degrees, but still felt incompetent because of the perception that I had of the people who were in the room, right? And after the training, obviously, it went well. People were very happy. The feedback was positive. But I think the anxiety and the fear going in was terrible.
In the moment when you started doing your presentation, how did you deal with the anxiety? So how did you bring yourself back down outside of the conversation with Terry?
So one of the things that I was taught when I was training to be a priest was an old man came to me. I think I'd done, I was still like a young person, and I preached in a kokerekeng or shared something. And I was very nervous, right? And this old man came to me and said to me, you're a great speaker, but those butterflies, you need to control. It's like, learn to control the butterflies because they're not going away, And right there and then you realize every time you speak, you will be anxious, right? And every time I speak, every time I officiate, even at your wedding, right? I was anxious. But I've learned to not show it. Like, my face will not tell you. My body language will not tell you. But there's a lot of activity happening in that moment, right? Of doing what I'm doing. And as much as at the end, some people come and it's like, oh, that was amazing. They don't understand the fight that happens inside of you during that delivery, right? And I think for me, that's the thing about imposter syndrome, right? It always forces you to question your capabilities. It's like, am I even capable?
Yeah, I mean, you're questioning your
doing
value
this?
effectively, right? That's what it's doing.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that's interesting about this for me is, and that's why I kept asking you, that before you got into
But I'm
the
also
room.
keen to hear your experiences,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we'll get there. But what I'm hearing is like, and it'll dovetail into my experience.
Yeah.
Is like, it's almost like this imposter syndrome thing. A big part of it happens because of the self-dialogue that we have with each other.
Naturally.
Even before you get to the room, even before you get to the big bad mountain that you're meant to climb, you're already telling yourself, I'm not worthy of climbing the mountain, when actually you've gone and you've done all the training. Like, you're fit as hell to be able to climb this thing. So there's a big part of it that's like self-worth, self-value, but self-worth, self-value like juxtaposed against what other people are going to think. And I think that's something we should actually delve on, and kind of spend some time speaking about it. Look, I've had multiple moments of imposter syndrome, mostly in my professional life.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I'm trained in business effectively. I've gone to school for that. I remember when I started at this consulting company at first. I walked in there as #1 consulting company in the world. They have like this, they hire only like the top 1 or 2% of students around the world, right? And I'm in that room with those guys when I started working there. Everyone there is, at least I thought, it was like 100 times smarter than me. Like 100 times smarter.
Yeah.
Guys from everywhere in the world, right? And I remember sitting there being like, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
Because, when and you're working for this place, you're solving the biggest problems in the world, kind of, top 3 problems of top CEOs, CEOs of the top companies in the world. So you have these like people that I grew up looking up to. I'm sitting in the room and I'm meant to be the one advising them on what to do going forward. I was sitting there and this guy's looking at you like, okay, like,
it's your time.
What must we do? And I think the first like month, 2 months of being at that place, I came there and I was frozen. I was frozen being in that environment.
Sure.
Because I didn't think I belonged.
Yeah.
Why? I don't have an Ivy League MBA, like I don't have an Ivy League education. I'm not from a kind of top 10 economy in the world. So, guys from China, guys from the US, guys from whatever.
Yeah.
For the first time in my life, it hit me that I placed quite a lot of value on how people sound when they speak. And because I didn't sound like them, I felt like I'm not as smart as them. Because there's something about that the world teaches you, and I guess media as well, about like what you're meant to sound like in order to exude confidence, right? I didn't sound like that. The majority of us don't sound like that. And if you go into the corporate environment, it's almost like the corporate environment expects you to sound like that in order for them to take you a little bit seriously, right? Which is also something that's, I think, it's important to talk about, because as I'm growing up, I'm somewhat bothered about the way we sound as Batubabantu in corporate environment in order to survive, right? So I didn't sound like these guys. And then you're sitting there with like, these top CEOs or these top managers around the world that you would read about in the Financial Mail, for instance, because that was my world. And these guys are looking at you like, okay, you must tell us what to do. I bombed it for the first 2 months. I would show up because physically with my body, I must be there. But my mind, my spirit, my ability just wasn't there because I didn't feel like I belonged. And why didn't I feel like I belonged? It's the things that I mentioned, but also I wasn't accustomed to that environment. Like,
can you say more? What do you mean you were not accustomed to that environment? What about it was different?
Okay. I grew up in Soweto and Riverlea. I wasn't used to that. Before I got to this consulting space, the places I worked, I mean, I worked in a call center, right?
Yeah.
I was a call center agent, right? Like taking calls, blah, blah, blah. I just finished doing my MBA and I did okay. So, I was moving up in terms of like changes of my world and my perception. But I could manage those small nudges, right? This one felt like too big of a thing because I went from being a local guy in terms of how I thought, where I worked, or whatever, to being a completely global guy.
Yeah.
Like at this place, bro, they call you today. Like, hey, listen, you're on a new project. It's in China. You need to be in China in 2 days.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Like, I don't. You know what I mean? So I wasn't used to that environment, and it's so fast paced, and your mind has to be so sharp all the time. I like deep down I knew I could do it, because I can think, but the speed and the expectation there is that it's incredible, right? So how did I deal with it? In hindsight now, when I think about it, what was great about working at this place was that they immediately assign you almost like mentors and coaches and people to talk you through stuff, to kind of help you through the environment and its pressures. Because the things that are not going away, the pressure is not going away. You're going to have to, you need to know how to work 15 hours a day and be sharp 15 hours a day. Very simple, right? The type of assignment is not going away. You're going to deal with CEOs, blah, 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 blah. That's what's there. The thing I needed to be coached into was the fact that I'm here and I belong here. I belong in this environment. I belong in this space, and I am good enough for being here. Do you know what I mean? So that's in that environment. That's what worked. It worked for me, and it helped me because I think everything I've done since then, it's almost like whatever is calling me out there in the world is calling me into spaces always where I do not fit. I don't have the experience. I don't have so I'm always an imposter. Even on this, I've never done this media thing. I'm imposter even in here. So I suffered imposter syndrome when Mxnzplain started.
Sure. Say more about that.
I don't know how to do this, bro. Like
we're learning on the job.
We're figuring it out as we're going.
Figuring it out as we're going.
I've never wanted to be this famous guy who's on like TV or media.
I'm not famous.
Never.
They're just a bunch of guys just talking on camera.
You know what I mean, right? Like it's never been. If I go back and I look at my, you do 5-year plans. I go back and look at my 5-year plan. Nowhere on my 5-year plan was like,
gonna say podcast.
Go do a podcast and be on TV or whatever. Never.
Okay.
But whatever is calling us to do this show, for instance, is much bigger than that.
Yeah.
And it's also, it knows better that, look, I'll make this work for you. When I go, be there and be yourself. Okay? And then it goes to, as Machita, as guys, do we even speak to each other about moments where we do experience imposter syndrome, and how do we deal with it?
Yeah.
I've seen in certain environments, like we come in where we feel like imposters. And so what we naturally tend to do is we shrink. And then like we're afraid, we let the other people shine because we're like, I don't think I'm good enough.
So I was gonna just to jump in, right? Like saying that was one of the symptoms that I also had at some point, right? Was the whole thing of, especially environments where a number of your counterparts are, white boys and girls, and you come into the space and you find that you guys have got technically similar background. You've gone to the same type of like maybe say schooling environment,
academic background.
University. So your academic background is fairly much the same, right? Same qualifications and everything else. And whenever conversations would begin or questions would be asked or tasks would be ascribed or given to individuals, there was almost like a natural yielding to your white counterpart, right? Because there's almost that misconception of, hey, Jared might know better than me, right?
But why is that? Why do we think Jared knows better?
Because I think, and this is something that we're chatting about, right? Is that the environment that most Black kids grow up in does not entirely prepare us for corporate or for the work environment, right? If you think about growing up in a Black home specifically, You are taught to subscribe to authority.
Yeah.
You are taught, don't look an elder or somebody senior in the eye when they talk to you.
Yeah.
You must refer to you never refer to people by names. You must refer you must refer
I
to them
say
as
sir.
as ma'am, sir,
Yeah.
and whatever it may be, right? That is the culture that most of us were raised under, right? You get into corporate and immediately there's like this old man who's like I guess at that point he's old, right? In his 50s, and says to you, call me Paul. And he's like, yo, dude, you're older than my dad. Now I must call you just Paul, right?
Yeah.
First, that's the first thing that you have to unlearn, right? Two, you're then told, as a man, when you show up, you shake another man's hand, you must be firm, you must look them in the eye and don't shy away, right? And you're like, oh, okay, now I need to stop looking down, I must look up, right? And then things around posture, right? Things around like etiquette, like simple little things, right? And I think we underestimate how small little things like just a dining experience at work can make someone feel completely out of place, right?
Yeah, because you just feel like you don't belong.
Yeah.
Right? Like that space.
Because that environment is
not
foreign
for
to
you.
us, right?
Yeah.
It's foreign,
Yeah.
right? A very simple thing. A friend of mine, Ellen Makubani, went to, so he was at Rhodes. And I think during his time there, one of the things they asked the canteen to do was to introduce a spoon for dinner, right? Because etiquette in I guess Western culture is that dinner is a knife and a fork, right? But growing up in the township, 90% of the time, every meal, right, from starter to dessert, we use a spoon, right? The times where you use a knife and fork is literally once every 5 years.
Yeah.
And that's when you have that rich aunt that invites everyone and decides to put a knife and fork at the table, right?
Yeah.
But I think the normal way of eating in most township homes was spoon or your hands, right? And now you get into this corporate environment that says, okay, you're going to wear a tie, you're going to wear a suit, your hair must be cut a certain way, you must present yourself a certain way, you must sound a certain way, right? And I think part of it is when you look at even how we behave, and I liked when you said you don't like how, Black professionals sound, but also that sound is a sound of survival, right? How me and you sound on this podcast as we speak now is a sound of survival, right? Because immediately we start to speak English in what people loosely use as an African accent, right? Immediately there's an assumption that you're not clever enough, right? So we were taught at a very early age that this
twang.
The twang helps, right? So the twang is important. How you speak your English, enunciation, and all these things become huge factors.
Yeah.
And I think those are some of the things where when people transition from environments that are different, those are some of the, I guess, cultural gaps that are not filled by a lot of corporate spaces because they overlook those environments, right? Very simple things where if you have a year-end function with, say, your senior executive with your juniors, and then you have, I guess, your interns in there, and then some companies will invite their support staff to come into that space. You can see and feel the tension in that room just walking in, right? Because these are like 4 different worlds coming in, right? That guy who's an intern has never seen access to so much alcohol at an event, and it's free, right? And what do they normally do? They get really drunk, right? Which is corporate 101 sabotage, right? Like it's one of the things you don't do in the workspace, right? Is you never get drunk at a work event. But a lot of these boys and girls, that's exactly what happens because of that excitement of something new. Right?
Yeah, look, I mean, that kind of builds onto the point I was trying to make earlier, that what I've seen happen a lot of the times when we go into spaces where we feel like we don't belong, we then overcompensate by trying to fit in too much, right? So now you instead of being yourself, right, you try to be
an
like
alter ego,
other, right, and you try to mimic the other that you are seeing that is seemingly belonging in that particular space. But does that not take away from you as the person, as an individual, right? Because who are you then in that environment? And I think that's a big part of why people have corporate anxiety. Have anxiety in the workplace because only a certain person.
Yes.
By the time you walk into the building of where you work or where you prefer, you become a completely different person.
You switch.
You switch,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of code switching that happens. And that code switching, I think subconsciously, your brain, your spirit, your very essence
your
feels
alignment
that,
switches.
and you are unaligned, right? And then you have to go sit in these rooms where actually you don't feel like you belong. You let situations trample you. When it comes to us as Machita, and part of why we do Mxnzplain, I don't recall having a conversation outside of you, but you don't count anymore. Wow. I'm having a lot of conversations with you. But with any of my other friends, when we talk about Ndwana, where someone has come to me and said, you know what, I think I have imposter syndrome when I'm in this environment. I think when I'm here, I actually don't know what I'm doing.
I shouldn't be here. I don't think
I shouldn't be here, and so therefore I don't show up as my full self.
Yeah.
And so to show up as my full self, what must I do? If I didn't have a corporate coach, I don't think I would have ever had that conversation with anyone. And it would have done me the biggest disservice because I don't think I would be doing what I'm doing today.
But I think, and that's the thing, right? I think sometimes imposter syndrome, if it's not dealt with, if you're not conscientized of it, it actually can be a prevent of performance.
Yeah.
Right. Because I remember I had a very good friend, Alison. And I think Alison was one of those, like, those people who are like unappointed mentors, right? And Alison taught me things that I'd never paid attention to, like stuff like eating with a knife and fork. It's stuff that I'd learned because my grandmother was that woman, right? She worked as a helper, in the burbs for many years, and then worked at the factory later on. But what she would do was that twice a week, she insisted that we sit at the table, and she taught me etiquette, right? From everything is to your left, to napkins and how you set that up and how you sit at the table. You can't put your elbows. She taught me all of that because I think in her mind, she realized that in order for me to survive the world that I was going to meet when I leave home, I would have to be different, right?
To somehow fit in.
Yeah, right. And I think then, when I met Alison, some of the things that we used to do, and it's stuff that I overlooked, right? Taught me about wine, right? How wine is done, how you drink it, how you pair it. And we went through multiple experiences of learning all these things, from your cheese to your wine and how you pair it. And it seems basic, but when I look at my life now, I'm just like, when people see me, they're like, hey, you are accustomed to this culture. But I think for me, it took a friend who made it fun to learn a new world without ever saying to you, you behave weirdly in this space, right? But instead, it was more of creating moments and opportunities to help me learn different things about this new world, right? To function. And I think for me, that's what I think as gents, we need to start doing more for each other, right? When you see that a young man is coming into the company, right? He's a junior, and you can see, and I think some of these things you can pick up, right? Like day one of seeing some of the new guys in the space, from how they dress to how the mannerisms in the space. It's an opportunity to call them up and like, yo, do you want to sit with me at lunch, right? And just slowly, gently, without insulting, guiding and journeying with them and adapting to the space, right? And I'm in the education space, and we see it a lot, where you have interns who have gone to schooled in the township, and because they have the marks and they're clever, they get scholarships or bursaries from a number of these private schools to then work in the schools and study part-time either through UJ or UNISA, right? And I think how some schools have done it well. I was involved at the program at St. John's, and they did it very well in terms of how they almost like train you into the space, right? And you realize how important it is that you need somebody who's responsible for those new boys and girls who come from, I guess, different cultural spaces to coach them into the environment, right? That onboarding process is important. And that onboarding process is actually not just a 1-year thing. It's not a 3-month thing. It is actually a very long journey. And so these boys and girls will go through like a 4-year journey of training, right? So from etiquette to professional way, they go for training sessions. By the time they qualify as teachers, they have been nurtured and cared for in a way that it lessens that feeling of imposter syndrome, right? And I think for many of us, if we had had moments like that in parts of our bringing, that feeling would have been less, right? And I think that's what it takes, right? Is in order for you to navigate imposter syndrome, someone who's ahead of you needs to be willing to journey with you.
Okay, that's a good point. What I'm also getting from you thematically is that a good way to deal with imposter syndrome or to lessen is to give people access to spaces, right? Like help people access things so that by the time they come in and that's their regular environment, they're almost accustomed to it. The question I have now is, are there actually advantages to imposter syndrome? Are there things you could look at imposter syndrome and say, okay, actually, because you have imposter syndrome, this is something positive that could come out of that for you. I'll give you an example. So what I think it's done for me, at least in my own experience, is because I felt less than in certain environments, I was compelled to push myself harder to perform at a level that was considered to be similar to those around me. I think it was above, right? But it was considered to be similar. So one of the advantages that what it did for me in the moment was like, okay, if I'm going to stay here, I need to work harder, or I need to be better, or be better than those that are around the room, because in order for me to not necessarily shine, but even just to fit in, I have to work harder. Okay, so there's that thing that it didn't work hard. But what it also, in hindsight, has done for me is because I was willing to go into a space where I thought and felt like I didn't belong, even though the space was like, you're here, you belong, and I worked harder and I actually thrived, it showed me that, oh, okay, actually, if I stick to my confidence and I'm not so arrogant that I don't push myself to work harder, I can actually make a positive situation out of this. And I need a bit of help from others. But it all also still comes from me. Right?
So I think, so for me, my personal experience is very similar to that, right? It's that whole thing that it forces you to work even harder, right? Because now you have to prove to both the external environment and to yourself that you're actually good at what you do.
Yes.
Right. And so you're constantly thinking to yourself, how do I innovate? How do I change? How do I shift things? And as positive as that may be, I think that's part of the anxiety that a lot of us have, is because of imposter syndrome, right? And I guess the positive impact of it making us work harder, we suffer from, I think when we were prepping, one of the things you said was it's that maybe it's an overqualification syndrome, right? Where now we are getting degrees unnecessarily so because we need to prove that we are clever. So the more I study, the more degrees I have, the longer my CV is, the more executive positions I hold, the more boards I sit on, the more important I appear, the more important they will think I am.
Yeah, and the more they'll just accept me, right?
And then you'll be accepted more, right? And I think for me, that is a positive thing to an extent, but there's also a huge burden in that need to constantly prove yourself like that. Because I think burnout with a lot of young professionals comes from exactly that, right? It's that whole thing of I don't belong here. And you're now working, instead of 15 hours, you're working 24. Instead of, if the minimum requirement is a master's degree, you must have 2. In order to impress your boss, you must work 7 days a week, you work 10 days a week, right? And that becomes a habit which one makes, I guess, South African professionals quite employable because we're like working, we're oxes, right?
Machines,
we work, right? We work as machines. And when you look at the stats of young South Africans employed globally, they're crazy, right? And a lot of these spaces have the same feedback, is that young or South African professionals are some of the most hardworking individuals you'll ever encounter, right? But I think that's part of the culture that has been built back at home, is that whole thing of you constantly need to prove your worth. And the more out of home you are, or the more unwelcomed you feel, the harder you work, right? And I think for me, that's probably the story of every migrant person in any country. Is immigrants are the most hardworking people in any country.
Overcompensation
because of that whole. It's one, overcompensation, and that realization of, this is not my space.
Yeah.
And in order for me to be welcomed, in order for me to be respected, and to be seen as somebody who has something to offer, I constantly need to be 10 steps ahead.
Yeah.
Right. And I think maybe that's part of it, right? Is that a lot of us felt like immigrants coming into the working environment. We felt like immigrants walking into spaces with people who had multiple qualifications and the CEOs, right? There was that realization that, yeah, sure, I'm qualified, but I'm not good enough.
Yeah, but also people have backgrounds different to yours.
Yes.
And those backgrounds a lot of the times seemingly fit better in those spaces than your own background, right? So yes, there's the working hard thing, but there's also, not to forget, there's the building relationships with people who can actually help you to move yourself up in any environment. It's incredibly, incredibly difficult to be successful in anything that's important in life without having people around you to kind of, help coach you along. So, I mean, that's my example. Is I wouldn't be who I am today without the few coaches that I've had. I would not be able to sit in the rooms that today I'm allowed to sit in and have the voice that I have, or sometimes the voice that I force myself to have in those rooms, had I not had a bit of help, a bit of coaching. Some people who believe in me and say, hey, actually, you're good at this. But Lebo or not, they would not have believed in me and continue to believe in me today had I not put in the work. Right. So there's that, because part of the issue that I think sometimes we see, I see in the working environment, there's also a little bit of this entitlement thing that's coming in from from young people mostly. If you call a spade, right? They come into environments.
So the Gen Z
and they're
syndrome.
just like, nah, CEO outside. And we're not simply like but the world does not work like that. You do have to put in the long hours, I guess, is a given, but also you have to kind of, put some points on the board, bro. So put some wins behind you.
So what as you're saying this, like, I'm reflecting on a book. There's a book by Richard Raw called Adam's Return, right? And I think it's a conversation that I'd like us to have at some point.
Sure.
And in the book, he focuses on the importance of initiation in society, right? And he basically looks at the 21st century environment where we've removed initiation. And when I speak of initiation, I'm not talking about hazing people or hurting them, or whatever it may be that is brutal and inhumane, but initiation in the sense that at every point and journey and as we grow as individuals, we need to earn our place in that order, right? And I think one of the things that's missing is exactly that, is that, a boy in the township, if you think of, in the villages or so-called ancient Africa, that we don't have full access to, but we there's bits and pieces of what we've learned of it, is that there was initiation processes at different ages of our growth, right? And even at school, like if you think about it, when you move from grade 0 to grade 3, when you pass grade 3, there's an initiation process of you going now to junior school, right? When you get to junior school, you finish grade 7, there's an initiation process of getting into grade 8. And that process actually, for me, is how society is designed, right? And I think for me, like the Gen Z syndrome is that because initiation has been made to be this bad thing that should never be done, there's an entitlement to positions before we've earned our place at the table. And that's a conversation that we need to have, right? Is yes, you are good. Yes, you have a master's degree. Yes, you've gone to the top school in the country. But have you earned your place at the table?
It's almost like, it feels to me like reverse imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Because like they probably feel like imposters in the space, but the way to deal with it is to be overly confident without the backup.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Yeah. This thing is intense. So I think for me the main thing, or the encouragement here, is I would love to have an environment where my friends and I speak about, hey man, in this space, I don't feel like I belong. How do we deal with this? Where I kind of share my stories and they share theirs, and we put together, I don't know if we could put like a network of people to help us to deal with these particular things, because I think part of the societal impact of this situation is, remember, as dudes, we spend what, 80% of our time at work?
Yeah.
So imagine spending 80% of your time in a place where you feel like you don't belong.
Sure. That's exile.
You are exiled.
Yeah.
Right?
You're
not home.
Confinement. Yeah.
Yeah. You're not home. So when you then leave work and you go home to your home, how are you arriving there as a full person? You're arriving there empty.
Yeah.
You're arriving there feeling like you actually don't know who this person is that you were the whole day. And then can you actually then be your full self with your family, with your kids, with your wife, with your friends? You know? Could that be part of the reason why some men end up in the pub before they go home? Could that be the reason why, some dudes kind of stop somewhere else first before Bayagochai to go refill, recharge, feel like I'm a man, feel like I'm a real person?
It's like fetching yourself.
It's like fetching yourself.
Sheesh.
The other thing that's hitting me now is, and this I think we need a separate discussion on probably.
I was about to say, like with you talking now, there's like 3 topics that have shown up, which we must add to the list now.
How does imposter syndrome actually show up when you are now spiritually called?
Sure.
When God calls you and says, okay, Mfanwam, time for you to come and serve.
Yeah.
I want you to be a priest. At that time, you know nothing about priests. You know nothing about the Bible. In fact, you don't feel like you are enough to stand in front of God. So now you are an imposter in front of the creator of the world. And yet he's saying to you,
as you speak about my life without my permission, I think it's a good time to probably just wrap it up a bit.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that I think, and maybe a follow-up conversation that we need to have is exactly that, is around, what does imposter syndrome look like? How does it show up when you have a calling? But also, how does it show up or manifest itself in home environments? And a part of me is actually tempted to say, let's find a guest that we can invite and have part 2 to this conversation, maybe in season 2 of our podcast, because I think it's a conversation that has so many layers, and so many people will benefit. And I think there's a lot of stories. But also talking about stories, I'm very keen to hear your stories. When have you felt that you didn't belong? How did you deal with it? Who are you speaking to? And so share your views on our social media spaces, on our YouTube page. Please subscribe, comment, follow, all of that. But most importantly, be part of the conversation. How have you felt when have you felt as an imposter? How have you dealt with it? And where do you find yourself now? And maybe the question also is, what type of assistance you think you need in order for you to show up as your most authentic self at work, at home, in your life, and most importantly, to yourself. But that said, ladies and gentlemen, this is Mxnzplain. I am Kabelo and
I'm the chief imposter in the media industry.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
And have a blessed one. Mxnzplain.
Sharp.